Most people assume that when a narcissist runs into you again after a long stretch of silence, they either brush you off completely or act like nothing happened. But what actually unfolds in those first few seconds is far more revealing than either option. To a narcissist, you were never simply another person passing through their life. You functioned as a mirror, one that reflected their sense of importance, their control, and the image they'd built of who they believed themselves to be. Once that mirror goes missing for months or years, something strange starts happening inside them. The version of themselves they used to see through your eyes slowly fades. So when they finally see you again, their mind doesn't respond the way an ordinary person's would. There's no simple, "Oh, there you are." Instead, their brain quietly runs a kind of diagnostic. They scan your face, your tone, the way you carry yourself, searching for one answer. Do you still see them the way you used to? Because if the answer is no, the entire psychological balance they once maintained with you can collapse within seconds. And when that collapse happens, a narcissist almost always does something immediately, something quiet but remarkably telling, something Jungian psychology explains with striking precision. Let's break down exactly what unfolds in that moment, why silence destabilizes a narcissist's inner world so thoroughly, and the reaction they almost always show the first time they face you again after realizing they've lost control of a reflection they once leaned on. There's a peculiar kind of silence that only exists between two people who once knew each other too well. It isn't the silence of strangers, since strangers carry no shared history in the air. But when a narcissist encounters you again after a long absence, that silence is thick with memory. In the brief pause before either of you speaks, something is already stirring in their mind. Carl Jung liked to emphasize a fairly simple principle here. People don't relate to others purely as individuals. They relate to the internal images they carry of those individuals. For a narcissist, you were never just someone they loved, argued with, or eventually left. You served as a psychological mirror that helped stabilize the image they held of themselves. Every reaction you gave them back then, your admiration, your attention, even your hurt, confirmed something essential to their inner story, that they mattered, that they carried influence, that their presence could shape someone else's emotional world. Over time, that reflection becomes woven into the narcissistic psyche. They come to rely on certain people as psychological anchors, and when one of those anchors disappears, the effect rarely shows up right away, but it runs deep. At first, once the silence begins, a narcissist typically takes control of the story in their own head. Maybe you were too emotional, maybe you were ungrateful, maybe you were simply replaceable. The narcissistic mind is remarkably skilled at rewriting the past in ways that protect its sense of superiority. In their retelling, they lost nothing of real value. They simply moved on. But time wears these stories down. As months pass without the emotional reactions they once depended on, something shifts in the framework holding up their persona. Jung described the persona as the mask a person shows the world, the carefully built identity that lets someone navigate social life while keeping deeper insecurities hidden. For a narcissist, that mask isn't just decorative. It's a fragile structure that needs constant outside reinforcement to stay standing. When you disappeared, one of the mirrors propping up that structure disappeared with you. At first, they may have replaced it easily, since narcissists tend to move quickly toward new sources of validation, new people who will admire, listen to, or emotionally orbit them. That's part of why so many narcissists seem to bounce back fast after a relationship ends. On the surface, it looks like resilience. In reality, it's substitution. But not every mirror is interchangeable. Some people reflect a far deeper version of the narcissist's identity than others, and certain relationships carry an intensity that's genuinely hard to replace. Even after finding new attention elsewhere, something about the original reflection can linger quietly in the background of their mind, not exactly longing, but unfinished tension. That tension resurfaces sharply the moment they see you again, because the earlier version of themselves that once existed in your presence suddenly comes back into awareness. In a fraction of a second, their mind compares two images: who they were when you were still in their orbit and who they are now, uncertain what kind of reflection they're about to get. This comparison creates real pressure. If you greet them warmly, laugh easily, or slip back into familiar patterns, the tension dissolves instantly and the old mirror is restored. But if your presence carries something different, distance, calm, indifference, the pressure intensifies almost immediately, and the narcissist senses that something important may have shifted. That realization triggers their first instinctive response: quiet scanning. It's rarely obvious. It happens through small behavioral signals: the tone of your voice, how long you hold eye contact, whether you seem nervous, confident, or unaffected. What they're searching for isn't conversation. It's evidence that the old psychological dynamic still exists, because the narcissistic mind depends heavily on emotional reactions as proof of its own influence. If your body language hints that you're still even slightly affected, their confidence bounces back instantly. The mirror is still active. But if your demeanor suggests the old leverage is genuinely gone, something more complicated begins unfolding inside them. This is where things get psychologically interesting. When a narcissist realizes that someone who once reacted strongly to them is now emotionally neutral, they face a situation their mind is poorly equipped to process. Neutrality strips away the feedback they rely on and creates a space where their persona can't easily stabilize. Jung believed moments like this force the psyche to confront the shadow, the parts of ourselves we refuse to acknowledge, the insecurities hidden behind our public identity. For many narcissists, that shadow holds feelings of inadequacy, abandonment, and dependency that directly contradict the powerful image they present to the world. When your reaction stops supporting their persona, the wall between persona and shadow weakens, and they feel that shift immediately, even if they can't put it into words. That's why the first moments of reuniting after a long silence often carry subtle tension. A sudden change in tone, an attempt to steer the conversation somewhere specific, an unusual attentiveness as if they're studying you more closely than before. None of it is random. It's the mind's attempt to regain orientation, because in that moment the narcissist isn't just meeting you again. They're confronting the possibility that the mirror they once depended on may no longer reflect them at all. Once that first moment of recognition passes, the encounter stops functioning as a simple reunion and quickly becomes an evaluation in their mind. A narcissist rarely acts impulsively when their image might be at stake. Their mind starts gathering information immediately, wanting to know exactly one thing before anything else: what psychological position they still occupy in your inner world. This is why the interaction often feels strangely analytical from their side. They might greet you politely or seem casually indifferent, but underneath, their attention sharpens. They listen to your tone, watch for shifts in your posture, measure how long it takes you to respond. None of it is accidental. It's a quiet test. The strongest signal for a narcissist isn't love or hate. It's emotional engagement of any kind. If they can still stir feelings in you, admiration, anger, nostalgia, discomfort, they know their presence still carries weight. Jung described relationships as spaces where unconscious dynamics constantly trade energy. In narcissistic relationships, that exchange becomes deeply lopsided, with one person unconsciously regulating the emotional temperature for the other. Over time, the narcissist becomes remarkably skilled at reading that person's emotional cues. So, when they see you again, their first instinct isn't to reconnect emotionally, it's to check whether the old pattern still exists. They might ask something as ordinary as, "How have you been?" But what they're really tuning into isn't your answer's content. It's its emotional tone. If your response carries even a trace of emotional investment, their internal system recalibrates and their confidence quietly returns, sometimes shifting into charm. But if your response stays calm, brief, and neutral, the effect runs the other way. Neutrality creates a psychological vacuum they struggle to interpret, since it offers nothing to grab onto, confirming neither admiration nor hostility, simply declining to participate in the old dynamic. When that happens, a narcissist often escalates the test. They might bring up a shared memory, tease you in a way that once got a reaction, or drop a comment that used to spark disagreement or laughter. These aren't random small talk. They're probes checking whether the emotional wiring between you is still intact. If you react strongly the way you once did, they get their confirmation. The mirror still works. But if your reaction differs from what they remember, something uncomfortable starts forming, because the absence of familiar cues forces them to face a possibility they instinctively resist, that the influence they once held over you may no longer exist. For most people, a realization like that might simply lead to curiosity or acceptance. But for a narcissist, It touches something much deeper, since their identity has been partly built from the reflections given to them by others. Jung believed the ego constantly tries to maintain coherence, an organized story about who we are. Narcissists maintain that coherence by continually gathering reinforcing reflections from the world. They don't just remember who they are, they actively confirm it through other people's reactions. So when the reflection they expected from you fails to appear, their mind hunts for an explanation, hostility, coldness, pretending. Whatever explanation they land on, the underlying tension stays the same. The person they once influenced is now standing before them, giving off none of the old signals. This pushes them into a state they deeply dislike, uncertainty, which weakens their internal narrative and pries open questions their persona normally keeps shut. Did I actually lose my influence? Did something inside them change permanently? Did I misjudge my importance the whole time? These questions rarely surface consciously, but they shape behavior in subtle ways. Some narcissists respond by pushing harder for emotional engagement, warming their tone, leaning into humor or nostalgia. Others shift into mild provocation, challenging you lightly or introducing tension. Both reactions come from the same underlying motive, trying to restore the emotional mirror that once confirmed their significance. Because for the narcissistic mind, emotional neutrality is one of the most destabilizing responses possible. It means they can no longer locate their own influence inside your emotional landscape. And once that happens, the encounter becomes a confrontation between the image they once believed about themselves and the very real possibility that the mirror sustaining it has disappeared. At this point, the quiet testing shifts into a second phase focused less on observation and more on regaining footing. Emotional dynamics in narcissistic relationships tend to revolve around maintaining predictable influence over another person's reactions, and when that predictability disappears, the narcissist experiences a subtle loss of psychological ground. This is often the moment people notice a sudden change in behavior, a softer voice, more confident body language, talking as if nothing significant ever happened. On the surface, it can look like simple friendliness, but psychologically, it's usually an attempt to rebuild the old relational structure. They may bring up shared memories, since nostalgia is a powerful tool for pulling people back into an earlier emotional state. Lines like, "Remember when we used to," or "You always understood me," are rarely as innocent as they sound. They're invitations to reopen the old emotional channel. If you respond with warmth, the old structure rebuilds almost instantly. But if your response stays grounded in the present, nostalgia loses its power the moment it fails to trigger an emotional return. When that happens, the interaction often takes on a sharper edge. The narcissist might question a decision you've made, drop a teasing remark, or subtly challenge something you say. This can seem confusing from the outside, since someone who just seemed friendly suddenly stirs up tension. But for a narcissist, emotional intensity is actually easier to manage than neutrality. Anger, disagreement, even defensiveness still provide feedback confirming that their presence can move you emotionally. So when warmth fails, mild confrontation becomes the next test. Jung observed that when a person's persona is threatened, the psyche often reaches for strategies that restore its sense of power, and in narcissistic personalities, this restoration frequently plays out through emotional leverage. If they can provoke a reaction, even a negative one, they regain a sense of orientation. But when both nostalgia and provocation fail to bring back the old reactions, something unusual happens. The narcissist realizes the script they've relied on isn't working anymore. This rarely surfaces right away, since narcissists are generally skilled at holding composure. But beneath the surface, their mind is reassessing everything because what they're facing isn't just a different mood coming from you, it's a fundamentally different structure of interaction. In the past, they could predict your emotional responses with real accuracy, knowing which jokes made you laugh and which comments irritated you. That predictability gave them a sense of control over the emotional rhythm between you. Now that rhythm is gone, your calmness breaks the narcissist's old emotional control, forcing them to confront the loss of their influence and familiar mirror. Once a narcissist senses this, their strategy often pivots. This is the stage where behavior can suddenly become surprisingly pleasant, gentler speech, more attentiveness, apparent sincerity, which can feel disorienting to someone who remembers the old tension or chaos. The answer lies in the psychology of reflection. Narcissists rarely pursue kindness for its own sake. When dominance, provocation, or leverage all fail, the mind searches for another way to reactivate the mirror, and kindness becomes that method, not necessarily as conscious manipulation, but as an instinctive attempt to rebuild what feels lost. Charm often becomes the next attempt, since it temporarily eases tension, creates a false sense of familiarity, and lowers emotional defenses, the very force that may have originally drawn you into the relationship. You might hear nostalgic remarks about the good memories, or claims that you were always different, always respected. These can sound heartfelt, but psychologically, they're attempts to reactivate a familiar emotional frequency. If nostalgia creates warmth in you, the mirror starts returning. Jung believed people frequently return to familiar psychological patterns when their identity feels threatened, and narcissistic personalities show this tendency especially strongly, since the mind doesn't easily let go of structures that once protected the ego. Charm is efficient here because it doesn't demand immediate conflict, it gently invites softening. If that softening happens, the narcissist feels balance returning. But if charm meets calm distance instead, things get more complicated, since charm only works when the other person emotionally participates. Without that participation, it loses the feedback loop that normally sustains it, and the narcissist senses that absence quickly. They might try warming their tone further, showing more curiosity, appearing supportive in ways that seem at odds with how they used to behave, still searching for the mirror, now trying to restore it through attraction rather than control. This stage reveals something important. They're less concerned with the reality of the relationship and more concerned with the reflection it provides. If admiration returns, their narrative stabilizes. If it doesn't, something more unsettling forms, the realization that emotional influence can't simply be recreated through charm, pushing them toward a deeper confrontation with the possibility that the dynamic between you has shifted beyond their control. At some point, the narcissist senses something deeper than distance, a structural difference in how you respond to them, not a passing mood, but a genuine shift. Their words no longer carry the weight they once did. Their tone doesn't trigger the old reactions. The leverage they once held seems strangely absent. At first, they may struggle to interpret this, since the mind naturally resists information contradicting its existing story, and for someone with narcissistic traits, that resistance runs especially deep. Their internal story casts them as the influential figure holding the psychological upper hand, so they search for explanations that protect the ego. Maybe you're pretending, maybe you're proving a point, maybe you're hiding pain. These interpretations let them keep believing the old dynamic persists beneath the surface. But the longer the conversation continues, the harder that illusion becomes to hold, and slowly a realization forms. The person in front of them hasn't just calmed down, they've genuinely changed. Jung believed real psychological growth happens when a person integrates parts of themselves that used to depend on outside validation, becoming far less dependent on how others treat them. For a narcissistic personality, encountering that kind of stability in someone else can feel deeply unsettling, since narcissistic influence relies so heavily on emotional reactivity. When another person's emotional world becomes self-regulated, the narcissist loses one of their most powerful tools of influence, and this is usually the point where they begin sensing a quiet loss of control, even if it never surfaces openly. Internally, their familiar strategies stop producing results. Charm doesn't soften you, provocation doesn't rattle you, nostalgia doesn't pull you back. Each failed attempt quietly confirms the same conclusion, that the emotional structure defining the relationship simply doesn't exist anymore. This realization creates a mix of curiosity, irritation, and quiet disbelief, since the version of you stored in memory responded in specific, predictable ways, and now they're facing someone who no longer fits that memory at all. That mismatch is genuinely uncomfortable for the narcissistic mind, since their identity depends heavily on consistent reflections from others, and this shift destabilizes the internal narrative they've maintained about themselves. Jung described this kind of instability as a confrontation between the ego and previously unacknowledged parts of the psyche. Questions bubble up beneath conscious awareness. Why aren't you reacting? What changed inside you? But rarely lead to real self-reflection, since narcissistic personalities tend to avoid introspection that threatens the stability of their persona. Instead, some try to reassert dominance subtly, others gradually pull their emotional investment back. Either way, the encounter has revealed that the psychological position they once held in your emotional world is no longer secure, and the dynamic between you shifts permanently because the power they believed they had over your reactions is no longer visible in your behavior. For many narcissists, that becomes one of the most unsettling discoveries they can experience, not because they lost you as a person, but because they lost the version of themselves that only existed through your reactions. Once the narcissist walks away, something interesting often happens internally, even while they appear completely unbothered on the surface, quickly redirecting their attention toward other sources of validation. But psychological encounters don't end the moment two people part ways. The mind keeps processing what happened, and when the encounter disrupted their expected reflection, that processing lingers quietly in the background. Memory doesn't just record events, it records emotional patterns. And the narcissist's memory of you almost certainly holds a very specific pattern where your reactions confirm their importance. This recent encounter introduces a contradiction into that story, since the person they just met didn't behave according to the remembered pattern at all. Now they hold two conflicting impressions at once, the memory of who you used to be and the person they just encountered, someone unaffected by their presence. Holding two conflicting images creates real tension. Jung described the psyche as constantly seeking internal coherence, and when experiences clash strongly enough, the mind tries to reconcile them, usually through explanations that protect the ego rather than genuine reflection. Maybe you're pretending, maybe you're hiding your feelings. These interpretations let the narcissist keep believing the original dynamic persists somewhere beneath the surface, but the emotional tension doesn't fully disappear. They may replay the conversation later, remembering small details, the tone of your voice, the absence of the reaction they expected, details that don't necessarily push them toward self-awareness, but do tend to linger, quietly processed by the unconscious. That's part of why certain encounters stay with someone long after they've technically ended. For the narcissist, that meeting can leave behind an unusual imprint, not exactly regret or longing, but a mix of curiosity and irritation. They might wonder how you became so unaffected, whether they misjudged their influence, or even feel an unexpected pull to test the dynamic again someday, because the narcissistic psyche genuinely dislikes unfinished reflections. That doesn't mean they suddenly become self-aware. Narcissistic personalities generally resist real self-examination, but the unresolved tension can still pull their attention back toward the encounter. Sometimes that curiosity shows up as quietly observing you from a distance. Other times it produces the opposite response, avoidance, a way of protecting the ego from further experiences that challenge their internal story. Either way, the encounter has left its mark because they've now witnessed the mirror stop reflecting them the way it used to, and once that image lodges in the mind, it becomes genuinely difficult to erase, not because they lost you exactly, but because they lost the certainty that they held real influence over your emotional world. In the end, the most important part of this whole encounter isn't what the narcissist does. It's what has already changed inside you. People tend to focus almost entirely on the narcissist's behavior, how they manipulate, provoke, return, disappear. But the real shift in these dynamics rarely originates on their side at all. It happens the moment the other person's emotional structure changes. Jung believed psychological maturity begins the moment a person stops organizing their identity around the reactions of others. Early on, people naturally seek reflection from those around them, wanting to feel understood, valued, admired, and those reflections help shape the ego. But as development deepens, a person gradually stops leaning on external mirrors to stabilize their sense of self, moving from asking, "How do others see me?" toward a quieter question, "Who am I?" when no one is reflecting me back. That shift sounds subtle but runs deep. Once your emotional center becomes internally grounded, the psychological influence a narcissist once held starts dissolving on its own. Their words stop defining your emotional state, their approval stops determining your worth, their absence stops pulling at your thoughts. From the outside, this looks deceptively simple, calmer, less reactive, more stable. But psychologically, something much bigger has happened. You've quietly stepped outside the emotional system that once revolved around them. That's exactly why the encounter feels so strange to the narcissist. Because they're not just seeing a different version of you, they're running into the absence of the entire dynamic that once sustained their influence. The mirror simply isn't responding anymore. This ranks among the hardest experiences for a narcissistic personality to process, since their identity depends heavily on outside reflections, and when one vanishes, their mind instinctively tries to restore it. But when restoration proves impossible, they face a reality they rarely have to confront, that they can't control the internal transformation that has already taken place inside you. They might try charm, provocation, or feigned indifference, but none of it can recreate the emotional dependency that once let them shape your reactions, because the most important shift has already happened. Your sense of self no longer relies on the mirror they once represented, and that quiet truth changes everything. The narcissist may walk away telling themselves any number of stories, that the meeting meant nothing, that you're hiding your feelings, that you'll eventually drift back to the old dynamic. But underneath all of it, a small realization tends to remain that the person they once influenced emotionally isn't standing in front of them anymore. Instead, they've encountered someone who has stepped beyond the psychological structure that once connected you, a structure that can't easily be rebuilt once it's been left behind. Jung often wrote that true psychological individuation happens when a person stops unconsciously orbiting the identities others project onto them, and instead builds a center of self that doesn't depend on those projections at all. When that happens, relationships shift in subtle but genuinely permanent ways. For a narcissist, encountering someone who has reached that point can feel deeply disorienting, because the emotional system they once depended on has quietly dissolved. And the most unsettling part is that it happened completely outside their control. They can't reverse it with words, provoke it back into existence, or charm it into returning. The mirror that once reflected them has simply gone still. And when a narcissist stands in front of a mirror that no longer reacts, they end up facing something they rarely have to deal with. Not your anger, not your admiration, not even your pain, but your independence. For someone whose entire identity was built out of reflections borrowed from other people, there is nothing more unfamiliar than realizing the reflection they once depended on no longer belongs to them.